Are the poor being forced out of living in the city? Gentrification is a process of improving urban neighbourhoods by attracting in wealthy new residents with increased economic development, better housing and lower crime rates. But it's a controversial topic. Gentrification can improve the quality of a neighbourhood, but it can also force out existing residents who simply can't afford to continue to live with the higher rents. Tenants in West London have warned that a plan to create one of the UK's biggest housing associations will lead to the social cleansing of poorer families from wealthy areas. They say the process can price out those poorer families, in this case from inner London. The same is happening elsewhere. For example, in New York, black-owned businesses across the city declined, and so did the African American population, in about 25 neighbourhoods across 15 years. While reasons for displacement vary, gentrification often shifts a neighbourhood's racial and ethnic composition. Average household income goes up through the development of new, more expensive housing, new businesses and improved resources. This can lead to community displacement for lower income families in gentrifying neighbourhoods as property values and rental costs rise. Why does gentrification seem to increase the white population in an area? And is this process driving the less wealthy out of city centres altogether? Simple questions with important answers. And let's start with this. Is the public aware of what gentrification means? And if they do understand it, what do they think about it? We asked Londoners those questions. Here's what they said.
I don't really have any strong views on it, to be honest. I'm someone who's probably going to look to buy a house in the next 10 years, so if it drives house prices up, probably not a fan.
I live in Battersea in southwest London, lived there for 20 years. When I moved there, it was a predominantly poor area. Over the last 20 years, house prices have risen sharply. I guess the downside of gentrification is it pushes out those with low incomes, makes it harder for people to get on the property ladder. But at the same time can have benefits because you end up with nicer streets, nicer neighbourhoods, good pubs.
Well, I'm aware of it. I don't know what I think of it really. I'm come from Bristol rather than London, but I've seen it happen in various parts of the city there. I don't know that there's anything much you can do to change it, other than the fact that people will move into areas where they can afford to buy property and then do them up.
It's nice for underdeveloped places to have some improvements done to them, but I think it tends to separate the very rich from the very poor far more, and we need the places for the less well off.
I have mixed feelings on the matter. I've lived in an area where I've seen it happening, and I've now left London because I'm priced out of it. So I've just spent 3 hours getting here to work for 6 hours and probably then another 3 hours to get home again.
I think it's sad. I think we're losing some of the finer parts of London, and there's lots and lots and lots of supposedly affordable flats, but they're not affordable to anybody. And particularly Brixton, I know Brixton really well. There's now champagnes and oyster bars in Brixton, which it used to be run down. I do accept that it's nice to see near up and coming, but it's not affordable for a huge amount of local people.
I understand gentrification to be the regeneration of usually an urban area, which often involves making it into a place which has different people living in it and benefiting from its stuff.
I do know what it is, and I suppose overall I'm slightly anti it because it can change the atmosphere of an area and also make it inaccessible to a wider range of people.
I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing if it pushes people out of the area because the rents are too high. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I do, because it's the experience of a lot of communities in London. But one is quite near here in Brixton, near where I live. Another one is Notting Hill Gate. Gentrification is what happens when an established community of working class, relatively poor people finds that outsiders are coming in, bidding up the prices of the housing, and another consequence, massively achieving a rise in rents. This then becomes associated with the interests, cultural and physical, of higher spending people. And so one way or another, the original community finds it can no longer live where it used to live, and it has to go away elsewhere.
To me, gentrification is a combination of racism and classism and a continuation of colonialism manifesting in our cities, in cities all over the world, right? Essentially, one group of people in a financially, wealthier set of circumstances, wanting to live somewhere regardless of who already lives there, and wanting to essentially take over that land and take over that space, often in most cases at the detriment of the people who are already living there, right? And in that sense, it's very, very similar and is linked to the entire process of colonization, And it's also not a coincidence that a lot of the people who live in those areas we're talking about now in these cities are also descendants of countries and communities and peoples who have been moved off of their land as well,
Gentrification often means that local businesses struggle to compete with corporations who appear on the same high street with much higher investments and advertising capabilities, as seen in Notting Hill and Brixton in the UK. What are the public's thoughts?
I think there's probably still a strong sense of people wanting to support those. Places like Shoreditch, the small companies do really well. You don't see a lot of chains, but it just depends on the area, I think.
Over the last 7 years, you see families moving out of the area. It becomes prohibitively expensive. You get the ruthless landlords move in, pushing prices up further. You get the expensive flat blocks that are all springing up all over London that aren't particularly in keeping.
I think there's a loss involved, and particularly for ordinary working class families who then get priced out of the housing market and lose, as you say, some of those local facilities. I don't think it's a good thing, but it happens, so,
Oh, I think it diminishes the nature of local communities. Little shops that you can go to.
Well, it doesn't provide any tone because it's a corporate establishment or, outlet. It has it doesn't necessarily even employ people from the local area. They're coming in as well from, further out of London anyway, so...
Who needs another Starbucks? Who needs another Costa? Who needs it? All those railway arches in Brixton, they just tripled their rents, and some of them businesses have been there for 40, 50 years, little independents, now gone.
One of the massive challenges of gentrification is when small businesses get priced out because the land values increase so much, or the landlords get greedy for rent.
I'm actually involved in protest to our local council at the moment, because we want to maintain some of the smaller businesses that gives character to the area. We've got about 750 people, so hopefully they'll listen.
It's the same as being people being pushed out because of high rents, I guess. It's not very good for local independent businesses if corporations are taking all the money.
It's not just the destruction of the people, but it's destruction of their economic base. All the rents rise, and the small local businesses, they get smashed out. The original spending power isn't sufficient to actually to satisfy the new businesses, which are basically aimed at the richer people. So the overall consequence is that the original people in that area have to move out. And then the question comes to where do they go? For a start, their community is being dispersed. And the second question is to where do they go, and will they have an alternative living accommodation? And there the answer is going to be no. They can go out into cheap accommodation, very often in seaside towns, but there's no work there. So you see, you're seeing the outside influx effectively smashing not just the community but also its economic base.
Well, I know people who've been directly affected by this, in Brixton Market especially. I knew someone who ran a spray can company and also ran a record shop. Radio station was run out of there. When the rent went up in the biggest price hike recently, had to just completely go, couldn't afford it anymore. Also knew a Guyanese restaurant owner she went from having, in about the space of 10 years, having her own shop to having to be in a caravan outside on the road. being told she can't have the caravan there, moving into that, it's really sort of small stall, like hole in the wall stall. When the rent went up again, had to move into the basement of a chicken shop, selling Guyanese rotis, the best roti you'll taste, you know what I mean? To the point where she couldn't even afford to do that anymore and had to move completely out of the area, right? And that's her entire livelihood, and an integral member of that community being forced out purely by the rent being raised in that market, and that's a clear example of that.
The population of white residents often increases during gentrification. For example, in New York's Bedford-Stuyvesant area, there was a 38,000 person increase in white residents. That's a 1,200% rise in just 15 years. Why, in the public's view, is gentrification followed by an increase in the white population?
I don't know why that would be. It's probably worth looking into, economics around it and the kind of money people are earning, but I wouldn't say I have a particular answer for that, to be honest.
Well, I mean, again, it's down to certain, different ethnic groups will often be low earners. They can be first-generation immigrants, and so again, they will often settle in a relatively cheap area, or the accommodation is relatively cheap. As the prices go up, they have to move out.
Well, again, I think it's about affordability. People end up not being able to live in their own area because they can't afford to live there. Prices go up, rents go up, and people can't afford to actually buy.
The cost of living, and there is a tendency, I'm sure, in most countries for the higher earners to be among the white rather than the immigrant population or people of colour.
Well, I guess those people have the money to sustain themselves in those areas.
The working class, white or any other sort of ethnic origin, are being pushed out further and further. Although those that came with the Windrush, it's got to be said, they bought beautiful houses in Brixton now worth £1 million plus, so well done to them.
I think there are at least two reasons for that. One is just people get priced out of the market. I mean, the cost of properties in Peckham now is ridiculous, so people who used to be able to afford to live in the area just can't. I think there's a power struggle. So I think in Peckham there's a really difficult ongoing challenge about whether people continue to feel welcome.
Pricing of the houses. When I moved into the area I lived in, we had a range of people from, shall we say, manual workers to a surgeon in the local hospital. And to a large extent now, that particular street are golden oldies like me. And we have some people renting at cost. That means they'll never be able to save a deposit to buy a house in the area.
I honestly don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
The underlying problem is just there is a shortage of housing for those richer people, for the first thing. And the prices are already much too high for them. So they come into the area where the prices are much lower. And underlying that, of course, is who effectively gets the better well-paying jobs and the economically secure jobs. And so that's another factor. Relatively high income, secure income is moving into the area. There's an aspect to this, is that gentrification starts very often in this community where there may be artists who provide a little bit of excitement and image for the area. And once the outside money comes in, the whole thing shoots up absolutely massively, but with disastrous consequences for the local people. And they have no alternative except to move. And there you're looking at the fact that the government no longer provides social housing.
Again, to come back to this idea of racism being very connected to classism, we're living in white majority countries. We're talking about America, in Britain, and cities like London. The idea that the entire system that promotes or enables people to have better life chances, to have more opportunity towards education, opportunities to get higher incomes, having already started with higher incomes, is exacerbated by the white power structures, white privilege, all of these things. And so if we're talking about wealthier people moving into areas that are fashionable or are strategically located towards certain businesses or certain opportunities, the majority of those people who are in that situation are going to be white or are going to be of European origin, right? So it's not strictly a case of white people going into certain areas and taking over, because also not only traditionally black or Asian areas are being gentrified, right? There's other areas of, working class areas that are being put through this process, but because of the nature of the countries that we're talking about, a lot of the time it is black, Asian, African people who are having their areas being gentrified, by this majority of richer, wealthier white people.
Let's use London as an example. The proposed merger between London-based housing associations Notting Hill Housing and Genesis would create a mega landlord with a combined annual turnover of £676 million and 65,000 homes to look after. These associations have already sold off 800 street properties in the last 5 years. And in the last 2 years, they have also increased the rental costs of 1,322 homes. Forced gentrification is how the Notting Hill black community described the process in which privatisation of housing meant they could no longer afford to live there. Does the public think that gentrification is pushing the poor out of the centres of major cities?
It's very difficult to get on a property ladder and even consider living in London. So I imagine if the housing estate comes up and some of them get sold before they're even at blueprint level, then I've got absolutely no hope in hell, and probably some other people who aren't earning as much money can't afford to live here at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I live in what was a Peabody house at one point, and you do start to see tension. I mean, I know that there are working class families lived on this estate a long time, and they don't feel it's not necessarily animosity, but it can flare up and you get a tension. Yeah, and it does. I mean, it pushes out the indigenous population.
Well, that's the trend, definitely. And I mean, I'm enough of an idealist to think that what you really want are socially mixed neighbourhoods where you've got people from different social classes and different ethnic backgrounds all living in the same neighbourhood, and that's probably utopian, but there are places where that does happen.
I think it's wrong. I think we have the responsibility to provide, what do they call it, social housing, and that we need the people who live in it very often.
Just couldn't believe what a dysfunctional society that has become as a result of that gentrification after the Olympic Games. I think it's a complete failure, unless you, of course, shopping and consumerism at Westfield, but it doesn't work as a community. So yeah, in answer to your question, yeah, it's pushed people out.
Absolutely marginalise the poor. I've worked with the homeless, and they're trying to send them to places like Hull and Grimsby. They've never been there. It's ridiculous.
I think a lack of genuine systems thinking is a problem. You need to think about not just about the economy, you need to think about the people, you need to think about jobs, you need to think about families. All has to hang together, and that requires a much more participative conversation, I think, about what should be going on in our cities.
Yes, I do. And it's our loss, because being poor doesn't equate with being uninteresting or ignorant.
Now that you've explained exactly what it is, it does sound like that, yeah.
Force is the word. I can use a gun and you'll be forced to do what I say. At the same time, I can use financial or economic means, and that's just as effective in forcing you to do something, in this case, to leave the area. The consequences, socio-economic consequences, are effectively ethnic cleansing by force. I would say that also involved in this is the lack of social housing. It's not just the outsiders coming in. And it's now the policy in this country, effectively, not to have social housing. And yet there is a way of providing social housing at a third of the existing cost, or even a quarter. And that's when you just simply use your own national bank with interest-free repayable loans. But then, of course, that proposal breaks the power of the banks, doesn't it? And that's why they won't do it.
Yeah, completely. I mean, there's a long historical process of this. Somewhere like Notting Hill is a perfect example, because when my grandparents' generation first came to the country, that was considered to be wasteland, right? And that's why it was given essentially to the Caribbean community to live there, right? We made it fashionable, we made it interesting, became a beautiful place to live, and then of course people wanted to have a part of that, right? Long history of people being moved out of the area. There's still the community holding up and, you know, maintaining some semblance of that original community, but in terms of how it was to how it is, it's been, you know, it's not even like the same thing. And the process is just continually ongoing. And because of the nature of our economic, social, political system, this is facilitated by business, right? A lot of the time it is about profit. It's not just the people who are moving into this area because it's nice. It's often to do with businesses facilitating that, making that happen in order to make a load of money from selling houses, certain types of businesses, and getting the money from those wealthier people, you know what I mean?
What, if anything, can be done to stop gentrification from permanently affecting local communities and their economies? Here's the public's view.
It depends on the government and what they, you know, think's more important. Are they more interested in money, or are they more interested in actually having a, you know, diverse society? In which case they would have certain housing set aside for that, but it's on them.
One of the things I like about London is the diversity, and I don't want to live in a homogenous community of the ultra wealthy. I like a good mix of people.
Active local neighbourhoods can make a difference, where you have strong personalities within a community who are prepared to, as I say, take up a cause, then something can happen. But that's down to individuals being able to galvanise whole communities, I think.
I definitely think we should still have council housing, and that the local authorities should be helping to find places for the people they need to, you know, in the hospitals, in the travel services. You need people to be living all over the place, not just outside and out of reach.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we should just go back to doing what we did in the I think it was the 70s and 80s, and look at community housing in a different way, and don't sell it off. You know, simple as that.
I really don't know. I mean, sack this government for a start. I don't think there's any impetus. I don't think Mayor Khan's got any particular impetus in more community awareness and more collective kind of community groups, I suppose, I think. Hopefully.
I think we rush things, don't talk and listen enough, make decisions that have unintended negative consequences. And I think really good listening with the quality of access to the conversation for everybody, definitely the first step.
They must provide affordable housing so as that young professionals like teachers, etc., can live in the area, because otherwise we will just have rich areas with older people, and we'll die of boredom.
I don't know, but it sounds like something does need to be done in terms of like the fact that it increases high rents. Maybe the government should put some kind of a limit in place on the rents and like cap the rents in the area or something like that.
The biggest factor is a system which allows on keeping part of the population happy by inflating their property prices, and they think they're getting wealthier. But of course, that excludes most of the population who will never ever get onto the property ladder. The other side is the complete failure to build social housing. After the Second World War, we had massive amounts, and it was very successful. Today, of course, this has been wiped out, and people are left to try and survive in the privately rented sector, and they are therefore liable to be flushed out by a rise, doubling, trebling of rents. We need social housing. We need the use of our national bank to provide interest-free loans for repayable and cancelable for social housing, which will build those houses at a third of the existing cost.
It's a difficult question because, you know, the obvious answer seems to be, you know, unifying as a community and working towards this and, you know, grassroots level. But with Brixton, for example, recently, a lot of that work was being done, but the local council completely ignored the efforts of the community and showed very clearly they don't care. So for me, again, as I said, it's all connected to a bigger issue and a bigger problem, which is a global issue. This, you know, colonialism hasn't ceased to exist. It's still ongoing. If you talk about resources being taken out of African nations, South Asian, South American places, the Middle East, right? All of this process is a part of it. And if we, really and truly, if we want to solve the issue with our community, it needs to be connected and looking at, you know, power structures as a whole within the societies that we live in.
London shows signs of gentrification across many of its inner city housing locations. This process is also happening in other cities, with New York being a case study in the mass-scale replacement of African Americans with white households in large parts of the city. If you're rich and you want to live in the city, then gentrification is good news. But if you're poor and you can't afford to buy or rent at the higher costs which come with gentrification, it could force you out of your home and your community. So the lesson to the less wealthy is cold and clear: pay up or move out.